of Leon, and the championship is called Sparks. Even though he no longer had to deal with Pumpkinhead and could sleep later than usual, thanks to Trudy Light's departure, Leon was feeling miffed when Napoleon picked him up the next morning. "A 3, he said when pressed for a reading. 3.5 tops. I'm sorry to hear that, Monsieur Leon. I wish I could adjust your mood like so." Napoleon reached over and fiddled with the needle on the moodrometer so that it pointed to great. "Yeah, well, you can't," Leon said glumly. His mood stayed in the low 3s for most of the morning, then dropped to the mid-2s after Lumpkin tripped him, accidentally on purpose, during a third period fire drill. He measured a tiny improvement at lunchtime after discovering that Frau Haffenreffer had packed a bag of crispy, crunchy, salt and vinegar potato chips in his lunch sack. It was a brand he needed for his collection. But then, Lumpkin snatched the bag away. Within seconds, he had devoured the chips and destroyed the package, which sent Leon's mood needle to the danger zone of crummy. Excuse me. During the recess, Leon swished 2 shots from the free throw line in a fierce game of horse. That raised his mood to 4. Yet, comfort again proved fleeting. "Lumpkin wants the ball," Lumpkin announced before Leon could secure the win. "But Lily Matisse is at HORS, said Leon, "and she's about to get an E." "Tough," Lumpkin barked. "Give me the ball now or I'll knock the stuffing out of you." Leon was tempted to satisfy the request by launching the basketball at Lumpkin's head. But he resisted the impulse, knowing it would trigger a swift and brutal comeback. "Take it," he said, releasing the ball. His mood dropped below 2, and there it stayed until last period. The school day ended with science, a subject taught in a big old basement laboratory next to Mr. Groot's woodshop. Leon had never set foot inside the lab. It was off limits until 5th grade. It had a number of pieces of technology in it that students were only allowed to use when Mr. Groot gave them permission for it. And if they were on the tablets for any other reason, without permission, they would have to have a talk with Mr. Groot. As soon as he entered, he understood why. The lab was filled with lots of serious-looking equipment. There were Bunsen burners, safety goggles, and racks of test tubes and beakers. 3 glass tanks containing tropical fish, a turtle, and a pair of lazy geckos took up one wall of the lab. A giant plastic python stretched across a locked cabinet filled with chemicals. Leon joined his 2 friends near a lab sink. "You're off the hook," said PW. "Looks like Hank the Tank is going after the new kid." "Who is she?" asked Leon. "Florence Parmigiano," said Lily Matisse. "Mom told me I have to be nice to her." "From the looks of things," said Leon, "she should have told Lumpkin." "Yeah," PW agreed. "Lumpkin's going to eat her up alive." Before Lumpkin could make a quick meal out of Florence Parmigiano, a brilliant flash lit up the lab. "Welcome, fellow researchers," a voice chirped from the back of the room as a dazzling pinwheel the size of a frisbee began spinning and shedding sparks near the blackboard. Even before Leon turned, he knew that the voice belonged to the bald, bearded man who had rescued him from the trash. Wonderful prediction, Von Guy. Whoa, she just did a wonderful prediction dance. Do that again. That's the science teacher, Lily Matisse whispered. He's new. Mom told me he's a little weird. And given how loosey-goosey she is, that means he must really be out there. No kidding, said PW. What clued her in? The bright green high-top sneakers? The wild man beard? Or was it the ponytail running down his back? Knock it off, Leon said protectively. Cut the guy some slack. The science teacher made his way to the front of the room, and as he passed Leon, he whispered, "Ah, the boy who defies gravity." With the pinwheel still spinning, the teacher grabbed a stick of chalk off the ledge of the blackboard. He drew a pair of jagged lightning bolts, and between them wrote the word park, so that the blackboard looked like this.
Yeah, he's making an evil spell to destroy us. Aren't you, Mr. Mal?
And he spelled sparks. He put down the chalk and wiggled the fingers of one hand, which appeared to make the pinwheel stop. My name is Franklin Sparks, he informed the class. Everyone, grab a seat. Don't we have assigned seating? Asked Antoinette Breed expectantly. Not exactly, said Mr. Sparks. My seating rule is simple. You can't sit next to the same person twice in a row. And before anyone asks me why, I'll tell you. Great science tends to emerge from unexpected combinations. As the students swapped looks of amazement, Mr. Sparks pulled a clipboard from a beat-up leather satchel. I'll have to take attendance, he said, at least till I learn who you are. Sound off when you hear your name. He glanced at the clipboard. Zeisel, Leon? Here, Antoinette Breed called out. Here, cried Leon a split second later. Mr. Sparks turned to Antoinette Breed. You don't look like a Leon. Antoinette turned red. Leon was also a little embarrassed, though pleased. His surname usually meant the end of the line, the back of the bus, the last to be called. Scientifically speaking, said Mr. Sparks, once attendance had been taken, a spark is a glittering spit of energy that travels between two conductors. Well, I'm going to be one of those two conductors. All of you will be the other. He wiggled his fingers at the pinwheel, hocus-pocus style, and once more, as if by supernatural force, sparks began to fly. You see that? PW whispered to Leon. He's got a remote in his pocket. Leon didn't respond. He couldn't. He was entranced. The little sparks Mr. Sparks had set off triggered much bigger sparks in his head. Leon remembered very little about his dad, but what he did remember usually involved big, bright, colorful bursts of light. Mr. Sparks? It was Antoinette. Please don't interrupt. But, Mr. Sparks, your sleeve! A spark from the pinwheel had landed on his shirt cuff. Oh, he said, nothing to worry about. A science teacher always takes precautions when it comes to matters of safety. He dashed over to the sink and turned on the tap. Problem solved, he said, as a wisp of smoke rose toward the ceiling. Lumpkin couldn't control himself. Hey, Mr. Sparks, he shouted, rocking back and forth on his stool. Students aren't allowed to be clumsy. Don't you know our school saying? It's nimble fingers make for nimble minds. And don't you know that nimble fifth graders avoid annoying their science teachers? Mr. Sparks shot back. A chorus of oohs filled the room. That sounded like a haunted house. Lumpkin abruptly stopped rocking, and Leon, PW, and Lily Matisse exchanged approving looks. Mr. Sparks squeezed the water from his sleeve and said, all kidding aside, I am indeed familiar with the motto of the school. It is one I endorse wholeheartedly. After all, The type of hands-on science we will be performing requires nimble fingers. For the next few minutes, Mr. Sparks discussed lab reports and field trips and the science fair held at the end of the year. But just as he started to sound like a normal science teacher, talking about normal science teacher things, he again did something abnormal. He unbuttoned his shirt. I know, said Mr. Sparks. Teachers should never undress in class, but this wet sleeve is a nuisance. And he stripped down to a t-shirt that showed a picture of a white-haired old man sticking out his tongue. The t-shirt said, "Anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new." Who has an idea as to who that might be? Your hand went right up, Sophia.
Albert Einstein.
And the name written below the quotation, Albert Einstein. Mr. Sparks tapped the face of the scientist. "Einstein got that right," he told the giggling class. "Science demands mistakes and accidents and failure. They're the building blocks of grand discovery." The pinwheel in Leon's brain started to spin again. "Mistakes?" he said to himself. "I know all about mistakes. And accidents and failures. Pumpkinhead is proof of that." More sparks flew. If Einstein's right, maybe the launch failure was a good thing. Words spun about in his head. Mistakes, gravity, spit of energy, grand discovery. All of a sudden, the words came together, and when they did, Leon's mood needle began to rise. 4, 5, 6,